So, in my intro video, I made the completely arbitrary decision to start PC gaming's history in 1983. Of course, by doing that, I'm going to miss out on some pretty serious events in PC gaming's history. So, that's what this video is for, to touch on some of the seminal games and events that are important in PC gaming's history, all of which happened before 1983. Enough waffle, let's get right to it. I'm the Geeky Dad, and this is a history of PC gaming. There is no other place to start but in 1962. The year the world came to the brink of nuclear war in Cuba saw the birth of a new artistic format. I'm not talking about Andy Warhol's soup cans, I'm talking about one of the most important pieces of gaming history. Steve Russell's Spacewar. There were plenty of other games created prior to Spacewar, but none of them had the popularity or staying power of Spacewar. In fact, the game went on to become one of the first coin-operated video games in the early 70s. The importance of Spacewar to all forms of gaming history cannot be understated. In fact, it probably could use its own separate video. So that's what I'll do. I'll talk about Spacewar, its development process, its legacy, and what it's like to play now in the very first Games That Changed the Game video series. The next seminal game we have on the list is Maze War. The exact development date of Maze War is something of a debate. An early version of the game, written by Steve Colley, was played at NASA on machines known as IMLACs. At this stage, Maze War was a simple maze game where the player could walk through a 3D maze. It wasn't until 1974, when Greg Thompson brought the game to MIT, that it started to develop into what many people consider the first multiplayer first-person shooter. The original game was played via 2 connected machines at NASA, whereas the MIT version could connect up to 8 machines at once. Not only that, but using terminal servers, players at other colleges could connect via the ARPANET, a precursor to the internet, and they could play each other across vast expanses of the USA. Assuming, of course, you had one of these incredibly expensive pieces of hardware. Maze War was also the very first game to have a number of features which are commonplace in modern PC gaming. First-person 3D perspectives, level maps, network gaming, player avatars, and level editing. It sounds like an incredible feat for 1974, but hold on. This is not the game experience you're used to. Movement wasn't fluid. You moved across a grid pattern. Avatars of other players in the early versions were simply names, which were later replaced as eyes in later versions. Although it sounds like this game was a precursor to the modern first-person shooter, there's a long way to go before BJ Blazkowicz is mowing down Nazis with gay abandon. Still, highly impressive for 1974. Zork represents a type of game which generally isn't seen much anymore, but was immensely popular back in the day. Text-based adventures were some of the earliest games ever created, and were wildly popular in the early days of PC gaming. Zork represents the very best of these games from the early days. The first version of Zork was released in 1977 by members of the MIT Dynamic Modelling Group. Zork was one of the first games that was transferred from academic institutions onto commercial home platforms, and Zork went on to be the best-selling game of 1982. Zork differed from other text-based adventures in 2 main ways. First of all, the richness of storytelling in the game. There was a mix of humour and dungeons full of unique creatures, objects and locations. The second was a unique text parser. These early text adventures were all controlled by typing in commands such as pick up pie, or eat pie, or regurgitate pie. The Zork text parser understood prepositions and conjunctions where other text-based adventures of the time could not. The Zork parser could understand pick up and eat delicious pie, and your character would do just that, and ignore any non-delicious pies in the area. One of the biggest achievements of Zork was that it demonstrated that games could be a rich storytelling medium. Have you ever wondered where we get the term roguelike? The popular term, which seems to be the bête noire of many an indie Steam game, all derived from a release in the 1980s called Rogue. Rogue was originally developed at the University of California, Santa Cruz by Michael Toy and Glenn Wichman. The game was a dungeon crawler where the player would explore a procedurally generated dungeon of monsters and treasures. The goal was to get to the bottom of the level and retrieve the Amulet of Amulet of Yendor, and then ascend to the surface. Graphically, the early versions of Rogue were not great. Dungeons, monsters, and the player character were all represented in ASCII. This was your player character. This was a wall. And this was a door. Despite this, which even for the time was of limited graphical capability, Rogue became immensely popular on university machines. Players used their imagination to fill in the blanks. The replayability of Rogue was huge due to the procedural generated dungeons, and permadeath meant that games were rarely the same on any playthrough. Rogue was ported to a number of other systems including MS-DOS, and the graphics were updated. However, the core gameplay was maintained and remains popular to this day. 1981 was one of the most important years in PC gaming history, for it was the birth of the PC. In 1981, IBM released the IBM Personal Computer. You can't have a history of PC gaming without talking about the dawn of the PC. There are a number of reasons why the PC was so successful and spawned a cacophony of closed machines, but ultimately the PC provided the best bang for your dosh in 1981 when compared with the Apple II or the TRS-80. Also in the UK in 1981, the BBC launched the BBC Computer Literacy Project and the Acorn-designed BBC microcomputer system. Now, as a child of the 80s, I remember these ancient machines when I was in primary school. And basically, we used them to play text adventures or Oregon Trail rip-offs, and it was my first exposure to computing in any form. While one machine was the birth of the PC, the other ignited many an imagination, and both were vital when considering the history of PC gaming. One was the birth of DOS, and eventually Windows, which came to dominate the home computer market. The other introduced a generation of British children to computing, myself included. Although we're not really focused on hardware on this series, we will touch on little incidents like this, which are so important. In 1982, we saw the birth of two more home computing machines, which ignited the boom in home gaming. The first was the release of the ZX Spectrum. What made the Spectrum different from any other home computers at the time was its price point. It was truly affordable to the majority of the British public at merely £125. It was vastly cheaper than many of the other models available at the time and was widely taken up by the British public. A similar craze was seeping the good old US of A with the release of the Commodore 64. While not as cheap as the Spectrum, its higher build quality and better system specifications came in relatively cheaply at $595. With cheap home computers becoming more widespread, it led to a birth of the bedroom coder revolution. Hobbyists would write games on their machines in their bedrooms, and some went on to become big commercial successes like Codemasters and Llamasoft. Getting back to the games part of the prehistory, in 1982, Microsoft Flight Simulator version 1 was released. This is probably the first game we've looked at that has something resembling graphics. Microsoft obtained the license to publish Sublogic's flight simulators on the IBM PC format. In fact, it was used as part of the IBM PC compatibility test. It was said that if a computer could run Flight Sim and Lotus 123, then it was IBM compatible. Pretty cool for a game at the time when they were still mostly viewed as distractions from serious computing work. The Sublogic games really established what flight simulators were, but it was the Microsoft version that brought it to the masses and popularised the genre. I remember flight simulators being big business when I was first getting into computing, and Microsoft Flight Simulator paved the way. Well, that's it for the prehistory section of this series. I'd like to know what you guys think. Are there any games released before 1983 that you would have loved to have seen in this video but I haven't covered? Have I made any glaring omissions? Or do you have any fond memories of the games I've mentioned? Please leave me a comment with your thoughts. Thank you very much for watching. I've been the Geeky Dad, and this has been a history of PC gaming.